الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على ختم الأنبياء وإمام الأصفياء وقدوة الأتقياء سيدنا ونبينا محمد خاتم الأنبياء وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. In our lessons on Mutammima al-Ajrumiyya, we were right at the end of the chapter on badal. So we saw that the badal, right, is of four types, right? بدل الشيء من الشيء, also called بدل الكل من الكل, or بدل البعض من الكل, or بدل اشتمال, or بدل المباين. المباين, and that could be and you know, of where you shift from one thing to another, and that could be for three reasons: غلط, نسيان, or إضراب, and we looked at that. The badal can relate to asma. It also can relate to af'al. So he says, وَمِثَالُ الْفِعْلِ. So that's where we reached. قال رحمه الله تعالى. We're just finishing off this section. مثال الفعل قوله تعالى ومن يفعل ذلك يلقى أثاما يضاعف له العذاب. Right? ومن يفعل ذلك, right? That's the مبدل منه. ومن يفعل ذلك عفوا يلقى أثاما. يلقى is the مبدل منه. يضاعف is the بدل, right? And this also, of course, an example of ومن يفعل ذلك يلقى أثاما يضاعف له العذاب. Right? من is اسم شرط جازم يعني تجزم فعلين, فعل الشرط and جواب الشرط. Right? And you can see the i'rab of that. Right? Right? So he gave just one example of the badal in af'al. This is noteworthy, right? That this, you know, we need to do examples of these things. Then he says, وَيَجُوزُ إِبْدَالُ النَّكِرَ مِنَ الْمَعْرِفَةِ. Right? And the example, نحو قوله تعالى يسألونك عن الشهر الحرام قتال فيه. Right? So الشهر is definite, that's the مبدل منه. قتال is indefinite, and that's permitted. Right? Yeah, so this is the type of this is badal ishtimal as well, right? Which we've looked at already. Right? Like that, what about the Shahr al-Haram they're asking about? So qital is not badal ba'd min al-kull. Why? Because is qital part of the month? No. But it's what are they asking about, right? And here, looking at other examples can be helpful, right? Okay. Other examples, يعني in the Quran, right? يعني in the Quran, إلى صراط مستقيم صراط الله. Right? Right? صراط مستقيم is معرفة. Why? Because of the إضافة. صراط مستقيم. صراط الله. Right? Right? So it could be, that's badal ma'rifa min ma'rifa, right? Both are, or you have إن للمتقين مفازا حدائق وأعنابا. Right? They can both can be nakir, both can be ma'rifa, صراط مستقيم, صراط الله. No, it's ma'rifa. صراط مستقيم. Yeah, because mustaqim is sifa. Correct. Right? صراط مستقيم is nakira. صراط, good. Sorry. صراط مستقيم because it's صراط مستقيم. صراط is nakira because mustaqim is a sifa for it. It's not idafa. Yeah, my mistake. صراط مستقيم. صراط الله, the badal is ma'rifa بالإضافة. Right? Both can be indefinite. إن للمتقين مفازا حدائق وأعنابا. Both can be. So the mubdal minhu can be nakira and the badal can be ma'rifa. Like the example. إن للمتقين إلى صراط مستقيم صراط الله. Or both can be nakira. إن للمتقين مفازا حدائق وأعنابا. Right? And okay, so that's all there is to the badal. 4 types, the badal. And it, and we looked at its rules. Then we have one of the chapters that the author the Mutammima adds to the Ajrumiyya, right? So he says, Babul Asma al-Amilati Amal al-Fi'l. The Asma that behave like the Fi'l. And these are 7. Right? These are 7. Right? And he'll go through each of them. Right? So he tells us, right, that اعلم أن الأصل في العمل للأفعال. Right? So any ism that acts like that is a amil is because it has a point of resemblance to the fi'l. Right? And though that grammatical reasoning to appreciate why things are the way they are, that's one of the things we'll be expanding on when we look at, like Sharh Qatr Nada, etc. They go into the reasoning as well, right? Which is why it's so important to get the rules themselves down. Right? So he says, وَيَعْمَلُ عَمَلَ الْفِعْلِ مِنَ الْأَسْمَاءِ سَبْعَةً. Right? There's 7 types of asma that behave like the fi'l. Right? And you could make a summary list, because he doesn't, which is the masdar, the ism fa'il, the ism maf'ul, sighatul mubalagha, as-sifatul mushabbaha, ismul fi'l, and ismul tafdil. Right? These are 7. Each has some conditions, right? Right? Okay. Al-awwal al-masdar. The first is the masdar. Right? And there's a good definition shared by al-Ahdal, right? That al-masdar huwa ismu al-hadath al-jari ala al-fi'l. Right? Right? Is the name, right, of the action that occurs, through the hadath, the trace, the consequence that happens through the action. So he says, bishart. Right? And there is one main shart, or you can see it in 2 parts, right? So he says, بشرط أن يحل محله فعل مع أن أو مع ما. Right? Right? So it acts where that you could take the masdar out and replace it with a fi'l accompanied by an or by ma. What's the example? نحو يعجبني ضربك زيدا أي أن تضرب زيدا. يعجبني أن تضرب زيدا. That's the مشابهة للفعل. That's why it acts. Right? والثاني نحو يعجبني ضربك زيدا أي ما ضربته. عفوا يعجبني ضربك زيدا أي ما تضربه. Right? 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 So it can have the meaning, it can be replaced by an or by ma. And the two things convey slightly different meanings. Right? ونحو, and then he says وهو ثلاثة أقسام. The masdar is three types. Right? 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 It's three types with respect to its states at the time of its acting in this way. Meaning مضاف, منون, and مقرون بال. Right? Right? So there's two primary ones. Right? Which is مضاف and منون. And with the L is shadh. Right? So the masdar has three aqsam: مضاف, and that's the most common. Right? Like the examples he's given. يعجبني ضربك زيدا, for example. Right? It's مضاف. But munawwan also acts, but it's less common, and with an L is shadh. So let's see what he has to say. So he says وهو ثلاثة أقسام مضاف ومنون ومقرون بال فإعماله مضافا أكثر من إعمال القسمين كالمثالين. Right? Like the previous examples, both are مضاف. يعجبني ضربك زيدا. Right? Right? Etc. وكقوله تعالى ولولا دفع الله الناس. ولولا دفع الله الناس. What's the shahid? Right? 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 لولا أن يدفع الله الناس. Right? Right? لولا دفع الله. دفع is a masdar. It indicates the action of the hadath of the fi'l. The fi'l is دفع يدفع. Right? The hadath itself is دفع. Right? Right? And you can see the i'rab of it. Right? Right? Now, interestingly, right? So he's introducing some ideas here, and you see, you must have, if you remember, when we looked at the Tuhfa Saniyya, as the text continued, he added complexity. Why? Partly to prepare us for the next text. So now we're coming towards the end. He introduces some concepts that are a little more complex, right? So the most common usage of the masdar is mudaf, right? Right? As he tells us. But he says, وَعَمَلُهُ مُنَوَّنًا أَقْيَسْ. The masdar acting with tanween. And it will be with tanween, meaning without idafa. Right? Right? Is aqyas. Is closer to the qiyas. Why? Because the masdar does amal because it resembles the fi'l. Right? And when it is in a state of tankir, when a state of nakira, it resembles the fi'l more closely than when it's mudaf. And the reason for that, as al-ahdas, because of the fi'l, in its meaning, it's nakira. That's the basis of it being aqyas. Because the fi'l is indefinite in its meaning. يضرب. The fi'l itself is not definite. Its definition comes from the fa'il in meaning. يضرب, تضرب, يضربون. Right? Where does its definition come? It's not the fi'l itself. Because what does the fi'l indicate? What's the definition of the fi'l, folks? أقسام ثلاثة اسم وفعل وحرف جاء لمعنى. What is the definition of fi'l? In Arabic, of course. Are you saying something? Yeah. ما دل في نفسها أو نفسه. So does the hadath have anything to do with it? Okay. So let's review these definitions. Right? Okay. So that's the idea of qiyas. Right? In itself, because the idea is the masdar behaves like the fi'l in that it either takes a fa'il or a maf'ul. It takes a marfu' or put something in nasb because of its resemblance to the fi'l. When the masdar is indefinite, the resemblance is more common, is stronger. But in usage, practically the masdar comes more frequently as mudaf. Okay. نحو قوله تعالى أو إطعام في يوم ذي مسغبة يتيما. Right? Right? So these verses, of course, are very powerful, right? From where? From which surah are they from? Surah, right? From Surah Balad. The idea of the aqaba, the high way, the way of high resolve. Right? وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْعَقَبَةُ فَكُّ رَقَبَةٍ أو إطعام في يوم ذي مسغبة. So what is the shahid? Yeah. إطعام يتيما. So إطعام is, the shahid is إطعام. Right? إطعام is a masdar. Okay? Of course, the question to ask here is, what bab is it from? أطعم يطعم إطعاما, that's simple. But the asl al-bab, anytime you come by a fi'l, you should ask yourself, do I know? Is it طعم يطعم or طعم يطعم? What bab is it from? Right? So anytime, even, okay, طعام, but this fi'l, what bab is it from? Where do we check for which bab it's from? That's what the Mukhtar al-Sihah is so useful for, right? Just make it a habit. Just keep it next to you. And Shaykh Abdurrahman Kharsa, Hafidahullah, would keep his copy of Mukhtar al-Sihah next to him. Even obvious words that I know he knows. He said, وَمِنْ أَيْ بَابٍ. So he said, okay, خلينا نشوف. Right? Even thing like something like this, right? So that way you pick up a sense, okay? So if you have to say, because alhamdulillah, most of the times we say at-ta'ama because you feed someone else. But what, the source, what is it? So that's something, it's min bab, what is it? So, right? Right? أو إطعام في يوم ذي مسغبة. Right? And the مسغبة refers to شدة المجاعة, intense hunger. يتيما is the مفعول به of the masdar. Of course, if it takes a مفعول, right, it also takes a فاعل. The فاعل is محذوف, right? It goes back to before. أي أو إطعامه يتيما, and the ضمير goes back to the insan, right? Right? And there are other examples of these. That's where you have to put in a little bit of work, right? Then he says, وعمله مقرونا بأل شاذ. شاذ يعني خارج عن القياس, right? Because then with the L it becomes even more distant from resembling the fi'l. So it's either qiyas or qalil. It's either shadh, meaning kharij an al-qiyas, wa kharij an al-isti'mal. Right? It's shadh, it's aberrant, that it has happened, but it's aberrant. Or it's either shadh or qalil. Right? 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 And what is the shahid in the abiyat? Right? Right? ضعيف النكاية أعداؤه يخالل قرار يراخل أجلي. So what is the shahid? النكاية. Right? The asl would be that it be nikayatan. Right? So this is shadh. Right? It's there, but you can't speak like that, basically. Right? Right? And we also understand that the fa'il of the masdar doesn't have to be explicitly mentioned, it could be mahthuf. So that's the masdar. The most common, it comes mudaf or munawwan. And the second category is of the al-asma' التي تعمل عمل الفعل is اسم الفاعل. Right? كضارب ومكرم. Right? And this has two states. If it has an L, it always works. Right? الضارب المكرم. Right? And it doesn't have L, there's two conditions. It's either للحال أو الاستقبال, and there is a nafi or istifham or مخبر عنه أو موصوف. So we'll see. Right? So اسم الفاعل كالضارب ومكرم فإن كان مقرونا بأل عمل مطلقا نحو هذا الضارب أي هو هذا الضارب زيدا. Right? هذا الضارب هو زيدا. Right? أمس أو الآن أو غدا. وإن كان مجردا من ال عمل بشرطين. Right? Why? In order for it to have that resemblance to the فعل. Right? That's what عمل بشرطين. الأول كونه للحال أو الاستقبال. Right? Right? The example would be أنا ضارب زيدا الآن. أنا ضارب is indefinite. Right? Without it, it doesn't have the ال. أنا ضارب زيدا الآن. أو الاستقبال. So, meaning it doesn't indicate the past. And Ibn Hisham disagreed on this, right? We don't have to worry what he disagreed on and why, but just note that in some of his works, Ibn Hisham disagreed on this. That's the first shart. The second shart واعتماده على نفي أو استفهام أو مخبر عنه أو موصوف. Right? نحو ما ضارب زيد عمرا. This is استفهام. Correct? Sorry, this is نفي. ما ضارب زيد عمرا. وأضارب, this ما is of نفي. He mentions them in order. أضارب زيد عمرا, this is استفهام. وزيد ضارب عمرا, this is مخبر عنه. Right? ومررت برجل ضارب عمرا, this is موصوف. مررت برجل ضارب عمرا. Right? It's a موصوف there. Right? For رجل. Right? رجل is موصوف بكونه ضارب. الثالث, so the أمثلة المبالغة. Right? He calls them أمثلة المبالغة. Right? Right? What are they? They're also صيغ المبالغة وهي ما كان على وزن. What are the أوزان? Right? على وزن فعال أو فعول. Good. أو مفعال أو good أو فعيل أو فاعل. Correct? فاعل. Right? بفتح فكسر. Right? So these are the أمثلة المبالغة. Right? And so they act like a fi'l. Right? Whether singular or dual or plural. Right? So here ما كان على وزن فعال أو فعول أو مفعال أو فعيل أو فاعل. Right? Right? But there's tafsil in it. Right? So these siyagh al-mubalagha, of course, they indicate, they have an aspect of meaning, which is that, right? They indicate different shades of mubalagha, right? And that's a separate discussion. The siyagh al-mubalagha indicate mubalagha in different ways. That's a discussion related to sarf, number one. Number two, it's a matter related to one, it relates to sarf. Number two, it relates to just in terms of the forms, but there's the underlying meanings, and that's something that we need to be working on as we get ahead. But we'll come to that. Right? So here again, there are two types of situations, right? So he tells us, وَهِيَ كَاسْمِ الْفَاعِل. Right? The أمثلة المبالغة behave like اسم الفاعل with the same considerations. In both, how are they like اسم الفاعل? Like in how they act and in the conditions of its acting. So therefore, that's why he says فَمَا كَانَ مِنْهَا صِلَةً لِأَلْ. Right? صِلَةً لِأَلْ, that it's in the definite. It's مُعَرَّف بِأَلْ. عَمِلَ مُطْلَقًا. It acts مُطْلَقًا, just like the previous category. نحو جاء الضارب زيدا. Sorry, جاء الضراب زيدا. Right? Sorry, جاء الضراب, this is صيغة مبالغة. جاء الضراب هو زيدا. Right? So why does it do عمل الفعل? Because it what? Yeah, so it's صيغة, it's من أمثلة المبالغة, and it's معرف بال, so it acts مطلقا. What is the consequence of its acting? It takes a فاعل. جاء الضراب أي هو زيدا. Right? وإن كان مجردا منها, if it doesn't have the al, عمل بالشرطين, it acts with the two sharts, right? Which are that it indicates حال or istiqbal, and it has a nafi or istifham or مخبر عنه أو موصوف. نحو ما ضراب زيد عمرا. Right? And again, you see here, the author of the Mutammima is careful that he's giving us a lot of details, but he's not giving us a lot of examples here, lest the text go beyond its capacity. Right? But to really digest these extra areas, one would, it's upon you to look for example, for tamareen of these. الرابع اسم المفعول نحو مضروب ومكرم. Right? With a fatha this time. Right? مكرم is اسم فاعل. مكرم is اسم مفعول. ويعمل عمل الفعل المبني للمفعول. Right? Right? وشرط عمله كاسم الفاعل. نحو جاء المضروب عبده. Correct? Correct? عبد is نائب فاعل. Right? So this is المضروب is مقرون بال, so it acts مطلقا, just like the اسم فاعل. وزيد مضروب عبده. So فعبده, this is the example of, it indicates either explicitly or contextually حال or استقبال. And here it's مخبر عنه, so it fulfills both conditions. فعبده نائب عن الفاعل في المثالين. الخامس الصفة المشبهة باسم الفاعل. المتعدي إلى واحد. Right? This is a condition for it. Right? 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 So the sifa المشبهة باسم الفاعل. Right? Does الفاكهي explain what is the صفة المشبهة باسم الفاعل? Does he? Yeah. Right? Right? So الصفة المشبهة باسم الفاعل, right, is يعني again you see al-Ahdal adding details but not really unpacking it too much. Why? Because then it would take us from the purpose of the Mutammima, which is to be a bridge to the larger texts. Right? So what the Mashayikh suggest here is, in these things, know that it acts, be aware that this is in need of a definition. Right? But we don't want to go into an extensive discussion on what is the sifa al-mushabbaha bism al-fa'il, etc., 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 which is why he introduces a new concept. The asl is that it be defined, that we see many examples so we get clear on how it works. Right? But we're going to stick to what so to what's mentioned here. One of the ways you could say he describes it because he gives examples. Right? So he says, كحسن وظريف. Right? So حسن and ظريف are a sifa. Right? That is derived from husn. Right? 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 But it resembles the ism fa'il. Why? Why does it resemble the ism fa'il? Because it takes a marfu', right? It takes a fi'l and a fa'il. And we'll see that in the examples, right? Right? It resembles the ism fa'il in that though a sifa, the sifa behaves like ism fa'il in that it takes a fa'il and a maf'ul. Right? So you could defend the presentation of al-Ahdal here in that he doesn't explicitly define it, he defines it by the example. Right? So sifa al-mushabbaha, that it's fi aslihi sifa. Right? You say wajhun hasanun. Right? What is hasan? No. What would describe hasan as being grammatically there? Is a sifa. But you say Zaydun hasanun wajhahu. What happens? The sifa now behaves like an ism fa'il. Why? It takes a fa'il, which is huwa, and a maf'ul in this case, which is wajh. Right? So al-Ahdal does give a definition, but I wouldn't worry about that. That you can see it from the example. It's a sifa that in the construction behaves like a sifa, and that takes a sifa, that takes a fa'il and a maf'ul. ولمعمولها ثلاث حالات. الرفع على الفاعلية نحو مررت برجل حسن وجهه وظريف عفوا برجل حسن وجهه. Sorry. مررت برجل حسن وجهه. Right? Correct? وظريف لفظه. مررت برجل ظريف لفظه. What does ظريف mean, folks? Right? Right? What bab is it from? No. Right? Right? ظرف كرم يكرم ظرف يظرف. Right? ظرفا وظرافة. Right? الظرف في اللسان. Right? So what does it mean?
Elegant or excellent manners.
Where's that from? Right? So there's a nice discussion on dharif in al-Ahdal. You can check it out there. Okay. يعني مررت برجل ظريف لفظه. So it's معمول here, it's مرفوع. والنصب على التشبيه بالمفعول به إن كان معرفا نحو مررت برجل حسن الوجه. عفوا برجل حسن الوجه. So what is the i'rab, folks? So it's not, is it حسن الوجه? No, it's حسن الوجه. Right? Yeah, it's حسن الوجه. Right? This is, it's in nasb. مررت برجل حسن الوجه. You can also say حسن الوجه, which is more evident, but here برجل حسن الوجه. Right? حسن الوجه. حسن is نعت for رجل, right? And it's a صفة مشبهة فاعلها مستتر فيها جوازا تقديره هو الوجه منصوب على التشبيه بالمفعول به أو على التمييز إن كان نكرة. مررت برجل حسن وجها. والجر على الإضافة. Right? So نحو مررت برجل حسن الوجه. Right? And that's the more obvious, at least in this context, right? And the asl right? ولا يتقدم معمول الصفة عليها. Right? لا يتقدم معمول الصفة. Here by الصفة he means الصفة المشبهة. Right? Right? الصفة المشبهة عليها. Right? Because the صفة المشبهة resembles the اسم فاعل, and the اسم فاعل, what does it resemble? The فعل. Right? 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 That's number one. بل لا بد من اتصاله بضمير الموصوف إما لفظا نحو زيد حسن وجهه أو معنى نحو مررت برجل حسن الوجه. And you can say حسن الوجه or حسن الوجه. Right? There's two ways you can do that. السادس اسم التفضيل. نحو, what are the sighas of اسم التفضيل here? Sorry? Yeah, أكرم وأفضل. And these أسماء التفضيل are also called أفعل التفضيل. Right? And Ibn Hisham suggests, and that's the two most common names. Right? You know, اسم التفضيل or أفعل التفضيل, indicating the pattern. Ibn Hisham suggested, as al-Ahdal mentions, لو سموه بأفعل الزيادة it would be better. Because they don't always indicate tafdeel, but that one is more than other. But titles, don't have to necessarily encompass. A title is not necessarily a definition, right? So there's leeway. Anyways, these are the two most common things: ism al-tafdeel or af'al al-tafdeel. Okay. And again, he doesn't give a definition of ism al-tafdeel. Right? Now you can work on it. There's a definition given in al-Ahdal. You can take it from there if you just like to keep a definition. But it comes. It's this sigha, right? And ولا ينصب المفعول به اتفاقا ولا يرفع الظاهر إلا في مسألة الكحل. Okay, now مسألة الكحل, right? So أفعل التفضيل, it doesn't put the اسم الظاهر in so ولا ينصب المفعول به اتفاقا. Number one, that's one of its أحكام. ولا يرفع الظاهر إلا في مسألة الكحل. Right? And what is مسألة الكحل? Right? Right? And this is an awkward expression. The Arabs said it and they unpacked it. Why does this work the way it does? Right? So, what we'll do now, the ism al-tafdeel doesn't put the maf'ul bihi in nasb. Let's take care of that. Right? It doesn't put the ism al-zahir in rafa except in a very rare issue, which we'll look at in a moment. It does act ويعمل في التمييز. In tamyiz it acts. أنا أكثر منك مالا. أكثر is اسم تفضيل. كيف يعني كيف أكون أكثر منك مالا, right? التمييز. And it also acts in the jar and majrur and the dharf. زيد أفضل منك اليوم. Right? Right? For example. Now, مسألة الكحل, it has a ضابط. It's a rare issue, but these are the kinds of things. Someone says, I've studied Mutammima. Say, okay, can you explain مسألة الكحل? Say, which kuhl? Right? And all these people say, yeah, alhamdulillah, I studied the Mutammima, study Sharh al-Qadr. They say, this مسألة الكحل. And there's a lot of detail on مسألة الكحل. Once I asked Shaykh Ali Hani and Shaykh Aminullah Abdul Rauf, see, what's the best explanation you guys have heard about مسألة الكحل? And they got into a lengthy discussion in the masjid. They got so caught up in discussing it, I walked away, they didn't notice that I got to the door and said, Assalamu alaikum. And anyways, so مسألة الكحل, right? Right? In this case, so the issue is that the أفعل التفضيل or اسم التفضيل doesn't put the اسم الظاهر in rafa. But in مسألة الكحل, you have a choice. Right? In مسألة الكحل يجوز فيها رفع الاسم الظاهر يعني الفاعل, right? But you can say it in more than one way. So what is مسألة الكحل? ضابطها أن يكون في الكلام نفي. right? ما رأيت رجلا. So there's a nafi, right? Number one. And you can number these, right? أن يكون في الكلام نفي. ما رأيت رجلا. بعده اسم جنس. ما رأيت رجلا. أن يكون وبعده اسم جنس موصوف. عفوا، بعده اسم جنس موصوف باسم التفضيل. ما رأيت رجلا. رجل is what? اسم جنس. It refers to a category. موصوف باسم التفضيل. أحسن. وبعده اسم يفضل على نفسه باعتبارين. Right, so what are the criteria? The kalam has a nafi. ما رأيت. After the nafi, there is اسم جنس موصوف باسم التفضيل. ما رأيت نفي. رجلا اسم جنس. أحسن. Here the اسم جنس is موصوف باسم التفضيل. بعده اسم يفضل على نفسه أو مفضل على نفسه باعتبارين. Right? Right? رجلا أحسن في عينه الكحل. في عينه الكحل منه في عين زيد. So this is the يفضل على نفسه باعتبارين أي by two different اعتبار. Right? So what I'd like you to do, it's good too, I'd like you guys to begin the next class to explain مسألة الكحل to me, number one. Number two, I'd like at least 3 examples, that's fard, or 5 على وجه الاستنان, right? Right, and then he says, that's مسألة الكحل, right? There are these ضوابط. ويعمل في التمييز نحو أنا أكثر منك مالا وأعز نفرا. وفي الجار والمجرور والظرف نحو زيد أفضل منك اليوم. Right? And there's some beautiful poetry. One of them, he says, عليك بأرباب الصدور فمن غدا مضافا لأرباب الصدور تصدرا. عليك بأرباب الصدور. أرباب الصدور, right? That sadr can refer to preeminence. Sadr is the front of something. So worldly people, عليك بأرباب الصدور, right? But sadr, the sadara, can refer to worldly preeminence. Hold fast to people of preeminence. فمن غدا مضافا لأرباب الصدور تصدر. Because whoever becomes connected to the people of preeminence becomes preeminent. And for the worldly people, you want to get ahead, be connected with the people who are ahead. But arbab al-sudur, and God knows what the poet intended, right? But also arbab al-sudur can refer to people who have sadr, right? The people of hearts. ألم نشرح لك صدرك, right? So عليك بأرباب الصدور, hold fast to the people of true hearts. Because whoever connects to the people of true hearts gets ahead. Gets ahead where? Not in worldly terms necessarily, but with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَإِيَّاكَ أَن تَرْضَى صِحَابَةَ نَاقِصٍ. And beware lest you keep the company of someone deficient. فَتَنْحَطَّ قَدْرًا. Lest you diminish in consequence. مِنْ عُلَاكَ وَتُحَقَّرَ. From elevation and become paltry. That's a very interesting line of poetry, and you can see why. Okay. But ignore the other. And the seventh is Ismul Fi'l. So Masalat al-Kuhl, we'll start with that. Now Ismul Fi'l has three ahwal. Right? ما هو بمعنى الأمر, and this is the غالب. ما هو بمعنى الماضي, ما هو بمعنى المضارع. Right? Right? And the Ismul Fi'l, right? Now, the grammarians had a lot to say about Ismul Fi'l. Right? There are certain things. So some said it's actually a fi'l. Others said no. Right? So these are established sama'an broadly. Right? Right? They're established sama'an. The Arabs said certain things. This thing fails the test of being a fi'l. So most of the grammarians are that these things are asma. But they do have a resemblance to the fi'l. And they're exceptional. Right? Right? So he tells us. So that's just a little bit, right? And Sahibul Kafiyah disagrees on this, but don't worry about it. Here, this is what most of the later scholars, that Ismul Fi'l is an ism, but it يعمل عمل الفعل. Right? And they're of three types. ما هو بمعنى الأمر وهو الغالب. Most of the أسماء الفعل indicate أمر. كصه بمعنى أسكت. Right? So if you say صه, it means أسكت. ومه بمعنى انكفف or أكفف. Right? انكفف. Right? انكفف. Right? Become, sort of desist from kaf. So انكفف. Desist يعني مه desist. وآمين بمعنى استجب. So آمين, there's اختلاف on that, but آمين, and it has different لغات. There's a lot of discussion about آمين. It has the meaning of استجب. وعليك زيدا بمعنى إلزم. So عليك, right, in this kind of expression is an ism fi'l, right? So عليك is originally على مضاف to the kaf, but عليك together behaves like an ism fi'l. Why? Because it acts like an ism fi'l, which is from the bab of يعني asma that resemble the fi'l, etc. So it passed the test of that. Because how else, why else does it take a amil? So this, though it is murakkab min ala and the kaf, but together it behaves like an ism fi'l in that it takes a amil, right? It takes a ma'mul, right? عليك زيدا بمعنى إلزم زيدا, right? عليك زيد. So عليك زيدا. Why is Zayd mansub? Because عليك together behaves like it's an ism that, so though originally it's jar and majroor, but together this became an ism. Why does it take a maf'ul? Because it resembles the fi'l. So it's in this bab. And of course, there's ikhtilaf, but this is the most cogent explanation. So alayka in this thing, right? So you could say alayka arbab as-sudur, ay ilzam, right? Etc. Right? It's come in the Quran. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu alaykum anfusakum, right? Right? So alaykum, right, is like that, right? Wadunaka bima'na khudh, right? 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 And right? وما هو بمعنى الماضي كهيهات بمعنى بعد, right? Right? And it's used for, right? And the Arabs differed on hayhata. Some said hayhata with a fatha, others said hayhati with a kasra. But the most common استعمالا is بالفتح, and that's لغة الحجازيين, of course, and Quraysh were from the Hijaziyin. The Tamimiyin said with the kasra, but we don't need to worry about that. And hayhat, the grammarians mention numerous lughat in it, right? We don't have بمعنى بعد, it's, you know, والشتان بمعنى افترق, right? شتان بمعنى افترق, to part ways. وما هو بمعنى المضارع نحو أوه بمعنى أتوجع وأف بمعنى أتضجر, right? So originally this expresses a sound, but it يعمل عمل الفعل, ويعمل اسم الفعل عمل الفعل الذي هو بمعناه فلا يضاف ولا يتقدم معموله عليه وما نون منه فهو نكرة. And we took this in the types of tankir, of tanween. If we were awake at that time or we reviewed, right, there's difference between mah and mahin, right? Right? يعني وما نون منه فهو نكرة وما لم ينون فهو معرفة. So if you say صهي, that is what? It's indefinite, right? It's يعني it's, so if it's بالتنكير, if you say صهي, what does it refer to? It's معرفة, But sahin is indefinite. Right? Stop all speech. Right? Sah. Or mah. You say mah, it is ma'rifah. It will be referential. Stop this. But mahin, it becomes nakira. Right? So it's absolute. Right? And these are rare, but it helps to use them. And again, examples help. And then we have باب التنازع في العمل. We'll stop here. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. I apologize, we weren't able to start earlier today. Some exceptional things came up. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil. I really have to jump into the other class. I'm very late. Barakallahu ta'ala fikum. So مسألة الكحل, you guys can plan out how you will apply كحل. We need some examples because it's a real issue, right? It actually comes up in the Quran. مسألة الكحل. Quran or Hadith, right? And don't complicate it. Just try to get the core issues, right? The other things like